The First Time by Jen Ponce. Chapter 1. The first time she saw the cat, she thought she was hallucinating. She hadn't seen anything living in so long. Too long. The world had dried up like a tumbleweed and was just waiting for her to catch a clue. She didn't know why she continued to look for food, for people. The invasion had taken everything, destroyed everything. Almost everything, she amended. With a sigh of relief, she let her overladen backpack drop to her feet, then dug through it for the 2 cans of cat food she'd found at town back. When food was scarce, food was food, though she hadn't gotten desperate enough to try it. Yet. She opened one of the cans and clicked her tongue, her heart beating entirely too hard for her to deny this was important. "Kitty, here, kitty." A rumble in the distance drew her eyes. The storm that had been chasing her all morning was catching up. Once it hit, it would soak the area for hours if not days. The weather hadn't been the same since the last ship disappeared. She'd need to get somewhere safe, and soon. A soft meow made her jump. She hadn't heard the noise of another living thing for months. "Hey kitty, I'm nice, I promise, and I have food," she said, pushing the tin toward the sleek black animal that appeared through a hole in the wall. It wasn't emaciated. Hell, it looked better fed than she was. Were there living things here? A louder, closer rumble made her skin crawl. One glance at the horizon and she saw the flares of light in the roiling black clouds. It was going to be a really bad one. If she didn't find a safe place. "Hey," she said, distracted by the cat's soft head bump against her elbow. She reached out slowly, cautiously, and let it sniff her fingers before darting to scratch it under the chin. "Oh, you are adorable." Her voice was raspy from disuse, and it shook a little from the emotion that welled as sudden as a storm. "Can I pick you up? We need to get inside." When she reached for it, it hopped down and trotted a couple of feet away before turning back to meow at her. Did it want her to follow? Well, what the hell? She scooped up the cat food and shouldered her pack with a groan. "Lead on, Macduff." The cat made a disgusted sound, or so she imagined. "Pinky?" she asked as she followed the cat. It went around the wall instead of darting under, something she was grateful for. She doubted she could scale the brick wall, not with her pack. "Panther? Frisky?" The cat's tail twitched. Amusement? Annoyance? She vowed not to annoy it. She hadn't realized how miserably lonely she'd been until she saw the lovely little animal. The thought of it running off made her want to cry, and she fought off those ridiculous tears as she trailed the cat. There were signs that townspeople had tried to fight off the invaders. Sandbags, furniture, cars were piled up in semicircles around the outside of a tall, sand-colored building. The windows had been boarded up and reinforced. Shell casings littered the ground. The cat meowed. It stood in front of a small cat door inexplicably installed in the bigger door. Seconds later, a lock on the inside of the door rattled. The cat food tin fell from her nerveless fingers as the door swung open. Chapter 2. The pistol in his hand felt heavy and got heavier when he saw the woman at the bottom of the stairs. A woman. A human. A living, breathing human. He thought he was the only one left. For too long, they just stared at each other, then the rumble of thunder knocked him out of his surprise. "Come in," he croaked. His cat wound around his ankles, purring. "Come in," he repeated when she didn't move. I'm not a creeper." "You have a gun. Why?" Her voice sounded as raspy as his. How long had it been since she'd seen anyone? Were they the last people on Earth? He looked down at the weapon in his hand, its weight accusatory. He couldn't tell her he'd been holding the gun to the underside of his chin just minutes ago. The only thing that had stayed his finger on the trigger was whiskey. Who would feed him when he was gone? Okay, he would feed him. His body. For a while, until he rotted. But after? Who would care for whiskey after? As the days passed, as time stretched inconsiderately ahead without end but also without relief, without hope, the idea of ending his own limping, pained existence had grown stronger until it was the only thing in his head. I'll get a drink of water, then I'll kill myself. I'll kill myself before I go to sleep tonight. I'll sit up on the roof and that way my body will fall to the ground. Splat. When she smiled, a tired, dusty but hopeful smile, it chased away everything else. I have a rope in my bag, she said. He nodded. She knew. Come in, please. The storm, it's safe here. Lightning rods, everything's grounded. Yeah, please, he said, the plea in his voice verging on desperate. Hell, not verging. Was. Please come in. Okay. As dusty as she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Not romance-wise, but humanity-wise. There was noise here not made by him or whiskey. There was breath. There was life. He'd begun to think he might be a ghost in this graveyard of a world. She changed everything. I'm Jack. Annie. The most beautiful name in the world. Annie, this is Whiskey. I think he saved my life. She squatted to pet the cat, then let herself fall on her ass. This pack is heavy. Whiskey purred loudly and buttered her hand. He likes you. I had cat food, she said. I dropped it when you opened the door. Shit. It's all right. He'll go out and eat it. The storm. Right. He stood there feeling dumb as he nodded his head, then finally said, Right, I'll go get it. The storm. The wind had picked up in the short time he'd been inside, and he got a face full of dirt when he darted down the steps to save the food. Cat food. He hadn't seen a tin of food like this in... how long? A crack of thunder reminded him it was unwise to stay outside. With one last worried look at the storm, he dashed back up the stairs and slammed the door behind him. 2 months ago, a storm had rolled through so hard he'd been certain the building would come down around his ears. For a guy who ideated about suicide several times a day, he sure had been scared. Now he had someone to live for. Hell, now he had someone to lose. Chapter 3. Are you hungry? He asked when he came back inside, all earnest smiles and nerves. She was nervous too. It was just so weird to be around a living, breathing person again. She'd fantasized about it for so long, and now here she was with Jack. Jack and Whiskey. The cat purred in her lap, and she stroked his soft fur, murmuring sweet nothings to him. Sensory overload. That might explain the slight headache that wrapped her head in a band of iron. Would it tighten or loosen? She had medicine in her pack, but she didn't want to disturb the kitty. Not yet. Jack was cooking something on a small camp stove that he'd placed on a protected window ledge. The window howled through the boarded-up windows and rattled the frames. Rain pelted them, but despite the fury outside, they were dry. Warm. Safe? She felt safe. Jack had kept a steady stream of conversation as he heated slices of canned ham with pineapple. It smelled amazing. She hadn't cooked anything for so long, she wasn't sure what to expect, but her stomach growled as if it knew. When the invasion happened, fire had given humanity away, and despite watching the ships disappear into the heavens, she hadn't gotten over her fear. It tickled against her brain even now, adding to the slow tightening of the band around her head. She told herself they were safe. They were okay. Even if they still lurked in the sky above, they wouldn't be able to detect anything amidst the wind and rain. Right? Something of her fear must have shown on her face because he said, I've been cooking for weeks now. She nodded, then dug through a side pocket to get the pill bottle. She unscrewed the cap on her water bottle and swallowed 3 tablets. You okay? Yeah. He beamed at her, then used his spatula to slide the ham on slices of thick, white sourdough. Bread? She asked, wonder in her voice. It's really sour, but yeah, I found several bags of flour 3 months ago. Found this book about wild yeast bread and had to try it. It's pretty good, I think. Bread. She gazed at the plate, salivating, then picked up a slice and lifted it to her lips. The smell made her woozy with hunger, and when she bit into it, flavor exploded in her mouth. Hot and yeasty. Salty, sweet. So good, she moaned, then stared at him, embarrassed, only to see him bob his head enthusiastically. Right? It was worth the danger, the first time I turned on the camp stove. He took a breath. Are there others? He was a trembling, over-aired balloon, and her answer was a sharp, gleaming needle. Oh, he said. He stared down at his feet. Oh. His shoulders had caved in on themselves, and it was her fault. She wanted desperately to inflate them again. Just because I haven't seen anyone doesn't mean there isn't anyone. I found you. Whiskey meowed, and she impulsively kissed him on his furry head. You too. Right. You're right. If there's two of us, there's more. They both looked up at the crack of sound overhead. It was so loud, the walls shuddered, and dust filtered onto the floor. That's not good. It'll be fine. It does that when it's particularly close. She wasn't so sure but decided to trust him for now. He'd obviously been living here for quite a while. He'd made it almost homey, what with a bed tucked into the corner of one room, cheery bedclothes, and window dressings that hid the boards and sheet metal. There were many bookcases, each shelf laden with reading material. He'd settled in here. To live? She remembered the gun in his hand, the despair in his expression. Maybe he'd just been trying to convince himself one way or the other. And it looked like the other had almost won. Chapter 4. He didn't usually keep the lantern on past dark. There were solar lights he'd found that he draped around the room. It didn't give him enough light to read, but it kept him from feeling like he was sleeping in a tomb. Tonight, he wanted to see her face clearly. He wanted to watch her stroke whiskey and smile and take breaths and move. He wanted to see the life on her, to drink it in. And yeah, he was half afraid she'd disappear in the darkness and he'd wake up alone once more. Please don't let that happen. So I started walking. I couldn't stay there, not after they destroyed everything. She'd been telling him about her travels, about moving from town to town, trying to find food, water, safety. Safety from them at first, then the storms they left behind. I couldn't believe everyone was dead, you know. I always walked into town sure I'd find someone, and every time I didn't. She trailed off and he knew she was thinking of the rope she had in her bag. Her rope. His gun. How many others had taken that way out? He didn't blame them. How could he? But how many had slipped quietly into death after believing they were all alone? He reached out and took her hand. Gently, but took it. Thank you for not giving up. Thunder boomed overhead so loudly, he missed what she said. She leaned in close, and he felt the warmth of her words on his ear. Thank you for sticking around for me to find. His fingers curled around his, and she leaned her cheek on his shoulder. He thought about protesting. His shoulders were bony. He hadn't been eating a lot. Worried about whiskey. Worried about the food running out. Worried about, well, everything. They talked until the lantern flickered and he apologetically doused the guttering flame. Along the walls, plastic dragonflies and butterflies twinkled pink and green and blue and yellow. Sorry, he said. It's beautiful, she said. His body would have lain here rotting under those lights. Had he put the gun to his head yesterday, she would have found him there, face partially eaten by whiskey maybe. He could have destroyed someone he'd never met and didn't know existed. Hey, it's okay, she said, and he realized he was crying. He'd done it a lot since the end of the world, but this was the first time he had someone to hold his hand and wipe the tears away. She even told him everything would be okay, and as he relaxed into her sympathy, he realized he believed her. You saved my life, he murmured as Whiskey curled up between them and sleep stole over them both. "I think we saved each other," came the soft reply. Chapter 5. The storm lasted 5 days. Annie was grateful for the work Jack had put into his home. He'd sealed the windows so only a minimal bit of water leaked in. One of the windows had lost a board, but he had planks stacked in the basement to replace it. She liked it here. He felt safe here. But if they found each other, it meant there were others out there surely. Others just waiting to be found. The thought of others gnawed at her as they picked their way around the storm-whipped town. Junk had blown into the street. Windows not already sacrificed to the wind gods had been busted out. Branches littered roadways. Whiskey trotted along with them as Jack showed her around town, excitedly pointing out spots of interest. "There's where I found Whiskey. He was trying to bite into a package of jerky." When they slowed near a church, half its roof missing, 2 walls caved in, he said, "There were a bunch of people hiding inside when, I dragged them out and buried them. Had to do it with a backhoe, but I said some words over them." Her gaze went to the large mound of earth in a field to the south and quickly moved away. She'd left her town to escape the memories. He stayed despite them. Did she have the right to ask him to leave? How could they not? At the far edge of town, he showed her a cute little house. It was yellow, though the paint had been chewed up by the storms. The chimney was busted, bricks scattered across the roof and in the bushes below. There wasn't any window glass left, but someone, Jack, had boarded them up. "This was my place. Before." "It's cute." He nodded, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. "Thanks. We thought it was too small when, Ruby was born. But she, His voice shook. She put a hand on his arm while he stood with his head bowed. How could she ask him to leave? Why would he want to stay? "I wanted to live here, but with the storms, it was too dangerous." His eyes were bright as he stared hard at the hand-painted flowers on the fence. Tulips, roses, marigolds, love. "Whiskey likes it, don't you, boy?" He knelt to hide the tears, but she didn't begrudge him any of it. To lose a child in all of this? She couldn't imagine. She'd lost enough to feel the pain of invasion, and she knew no good came from comparing wounds. But a child? The teddy bear in the corner on his bedstand, the dragonfly lights, the pink frilly pillowcases amongst the solid blue ones. Ruby, his daughter. "There are fish in the pond," he said. "I spend a few hours there every week trying to catch something fresh. There's a lot of gear at the shop on spool. The one I showed you?" "We should leave," she said. He gazed at her, his thumb still cocked over his shoulder in the direction of the lake. "What?" She hated that she'd blurted it out like that, but now that it was out, "There might be more people. We need to find them. We have to find them." His smile was frozen on his face. "I can't leave." Whiskey meowed. Annie gazed down at him and he stared back, his big orange eyes unblinking. Accusing? Or was her guilt putting things where they didn't belong? "Okay," she said. "Are you leaving?" She thought of all the dusty roads she'd walked since watching her world implode, and she knew she wouldn't survive much longer alone. "No, I can't leave either." He nodded, and they walked back home in silence, Annie keeping her eyes on the cat. "I hope you know what you're doing." She didn't know if she meant the cat or herself, and maybe in the end, it didn't matter. Chapter 6. They planted a garden in a greenhouse made with small, square plexiglass windows, reinforced with steel bars they salvaged from the home renovation store. Jack dug a large trench in the ground with a backhoe, and they used planks to make stairs. It would keep the plants alive through the winter, according to the book they found in one of Jack's shelves. One such greenhouse in Nebraska had even grown bananas throughout the harsh Midwestern winter. They didn't have a banana tree, but they planted all sorts of vegetables and collected canning jars and other supplies in the hope their labors panned out. With Annie's urging, They painted messages on bedsheets and hung them on the billboards outside of town. They had to be replaced when the storms whipped through, but it gave them both purpose, and he hoped it assuaged her desire to hit the road and search for survivors. It made sense to stay in one place, didn't it? To put out the call and hope someone else saw? He told himself it was smarter to stay where they knew it was safe. On the road? How many times had she almost died from a lightning strike? Flooding? The unbelievably large hail that could kill a man? I feel guilty, Whiskey, he told the cat. They were in the boat, Whiskey with a paw in the water as he watched the fish swim by. Jack had 4 in a bucket at his feet, and he hoped to pull in 2 more before heading home. Anna stayed behind to work on their cistern and pipe system. The storms dropped so much water, it seemed criminal to waste it. They hauled barrels to the drain pipes that they shortened, and more barrels on wooden platforms they built so they could have showers. Cold showers, but showers. Jack had been washing off in the pond, but he agreed a shower would be better. Whiskey meowed. Jack nodded. Right? You found her. Brought her here. It was for a reason. It saved me. Us. I wouldn't have lasted much longer on my own. She wouldn't have either. One of us would have taken the express ticket to the grave, and then the fishing rod dipped and he was glad. Focusing on pulling in the fish kept his brain busy for a few minutes, but then the fish was flopping in the bucket with his friends, and Jack couldn't help but remember how her face fell when he said he couldn't leave. Why couldn't he leave? What was here for him, really? The graves of his family? His daughter? His friends? Co-workers? His elderly neighbor who used to bring over bowls filled with spring strawberries? It's safer here, he whispered as he baited a hook with shaking hands. It's safer here. We'd get caught in a storm, end up dead. Starve. Heads bashed in by an apocalyptic hail ball. He was afraid, but so was she. He was afraid if he left, he'd die. She was afraid if she stayed, she would. They'd seen the end of everything they ever knew and interpreted the danger differently. He dug in, she bugged out. But had they done those things differently, if they'd both dug in or both bugged out? Do you believe in destiny, Whiskey? Whiskey patted the water almost as if he was reassuring the fish and ignored Jack. That was all right. Jack thought he knew the answer, even without Whiskey's help. Chapter 7. They settled into a routine that felt good, and they had vegetables, fruit, and even a loofah plant that they both decided they needed to see grow, even if it took up space in their greenhouse. Jack had already dug out another long trench that they were laboriously filling with soil amendments, and gardening supplies. The roof was going slower on that one since they couldn't find more plexiglass. We can travel to the next town over to get more. Take the wagons. It's only 25 miles. A good day's walk there. Any houses on the way we could hole up in if a storm blew through? She worked hard to sound casual, though she fairly vibrated with excitement on the inside. Yes, she was proud of all their work and glad for the garden and greenhouse that would save their lives come winter, but damned if she hadn't missed travel. Not the loneliness, no, but the hope that would rise inside her at each new town. She missed that, even though it hadn't ever panned out until Jack. This time, she'd have someone to share the sadness with if they didn't find people. And if they did? She told herself not to get her hopes up too much. You okay? She asked when he stayed quiet. He took time with his answer. Yeah, he said finally. You must think me the worst coward, hiding here this whole time. No, I think you're a survivor. He nodded, though she wasn't sure he was convinced. I felt like a coward. When I buried my daughter, those people at the church, when I hid here instead of getting the hell out of town, instead of searching for others, I felt like shit. You didn't know how many times I packed up and headed out of town, but I couldn't get past the lawyer billboard. I couldn't make myself do it, even if it meant finding other people. Annie almost laughed. He thought he was a coward. He stayed behind, buried those he loved, gave them peace, dignity. What did she do but run as far and fast away as she could? She hadn't even stayed behind to cover her sister's face. She'd run away. Shame filled her at the memory of the smoking cars, the bombed-out buildings, all the corpses. So much death. She'd told herself she was looking for survivors, but she'd left behind a city full of potential survivors because she couldn't face the sight of her mom dead on the sidewalk. "Hey, it's okay. We're okay," he said. It was his turn to wipe away her tears, and she let him. So thankful for his touch, it made her cry harder. It was only after she choked out of her own confession that the tears subsided to hiccups and she was able to take a breath without shuddering. He hadn't said anything while she spoke, and now she trembled, waiting for his condemnation maybe, or his derision, but he merely said, "Neither of us are cowards." And she decided to believe him. Chapter 8. It took them a week to get ready for their trip after Annie suggested they hook up bikes to their wagons. It would cut their travel time down, though Jack worried he'd have to push his bike up several of the hills both there and back. When he expressed his worry, Annie laughed. "That's what gears are for, Jackie boy. Besides, if it takes a bit longer, so what?" So what? They fixed up a bike basket for Whiskey and fitted it with a soft bed. Whiskey had a harness that he didn't seem to mind, and he sat in the basket without complaint. Jack thought he might be as excited as Annie to be heading out on their adventure. In addition to plexiglass, they were hoping to find more seeds and maybe even a gramophone to play the records he had stored in one of the upper rooms. If it's still there, and I don't see why it shouldn't be, then we could have music. We could dance. Just in case, they picked out the records they wanted to listen first. They even let Whiskey choose one, a Beatles album. "Your cat has good taste," she said. "Our cat," he corrected before he could take it back. Then he was glad it had slipped free because she smiled at him in a way he'd never seen from her before. "Did you hear that, Whiskey?" she'd murmured, and Jack felt warm all over. When they were ready to leave, with Whiskey perched in his basket on Jack's bike, fear threatened to glue him to the spot. It was ridiculous to be afraid, and they were coming back in a couple days' time. "You ready?" He thought about lying and saying he was. It was what he would have done before the end of the world. Now, though, life was too precious to fib his way through it. "I'm scared." "Me too," she said, surprising him. "I like it here. It is safe and comfortable. It's my home, but this will help us stay here safely, together." He never thought he'd feel this way again. Light, free, happy. Even with the complicated mix of fear in there, he felt good. He put one foot on the pedal, then pushed off, Annie rolling along beside him. This world, it wasn't dead yet. Not while they were still living in it, and this was living. A breeze in his hair, a smile on her face. Whiskey purring in the basket in front of him. "Best day ever!" he cried, and though he wanted to spread his arms wide and pretend he was flying, he didn't trust himself not to tip over and dump himself and their cat onto the road. "Best day ever!" she shouted, her laughter caught and carried away by the breeze. Chapter 9. The first time she saw the cat, she thought he was hallucinating. When she heard Jax's low exclamation of wonder, she knew she wasn't seeing things. It had a color, bright pink. Jack breathed, brand new. They exchanged glances, and then they were trying to see everywhere at once. "Look," she said. Something fluttered in the cool evening breeze, a sheet that hung off a balcony a few blocks down. Were there people here? Living, breathing people? The jingle of a bell caught their attention. The cat was back, a pretty yellow tabby that strutted like she knew she was beautiful. Whiskey meowed and the tabby sat, staring with unblinking eyes. "You see her, right?" Jack asked. "I do. Come on, let's check that out." He nodded, looking stunned. With a grin, she reached for his hand and squeezed it. "We might have neighbors. Whiskey might have a girlfriend. The world might not be as lost as either of us thought. If they were here all this time..." They didn't find you either. Don't you dare blame yourself for not knowing about them sooner. If there's a them, of course. She watched him closely, hoping this wouldn't send him spiraling. When the tension eased from his shoulders, she squeezed his hand one more time. Let's go introduce ourselves. Every block closer, they saw more evidence of survivors. Survivors plural. Had to be. Cars were moved off the roads, gardens were planted. On the sheet fluttering in the breeze were the words, "Survivors here. Refuge here." As they stood gazing up at the words, the yellow tabby hopped up on a nearby car. Whiskey looked back at Jack, who unhooked the tether that had kept him from jumping out and hurting himself while they biked over. They wound around each other like long-lost lovers reunited, tails intertwined like Annie's and Jax's fingers. "Hello?" Their fingers tightened. Jack's face was alight with wonder. As one, they turned to look behind them. An old woman stood there with a basket in her hands. Her look of shock and awe must have mirrored their own.
"Oh, my dear sweet Sally, are you real? Are you too real?"
They got off their bikes and went to her, to the only other living person they'd seen in almost a year, and embraced her. She never would have done that to a stranger before the world ended, but now... "How many of you are there?"
"Of me?
The old woman tittered between tears.
Just one you'll be thankful to hear. But others, there's 6 of us."
6. Annie couldn't even fathom it. "Have you been together all this time?"
"No, honey. I was here on my own for too long, and then a couple rolled in torn up and starving. They were the first, Marvin and Teddy. Then Lydia came, Nando and little Pedro. Teddy and Nando are off looking for more people. Who knew anyone would just wander in on their own, but we hoped."
Her rough, trembling hands pressed against their cheeks.
"You don't know how badly I needed to see you two today."
Annie and Jack smiled at each other. Oh, they knew. They knew all too well. Her gasp brought them back to the present.
"You have a kitty? A real-life cat?"
"He brought us together," Annie said.
"And your cat brought us to you,"
Jack added. The old woman laughed and wiped her eyes.
"I always knew cats would save the world."
She gazed at Whiskey and the tabby.
"Oh, where are my manners? I'm Gladys, and that's Pearl. I know, silly name for a yellow tabby, but that's her name. Would you join me for tea? Maybe some sardines for your darling kitty there."
For one breathless moment, Annie couldn't find the words to answer. It was too mundane to comprehend. How had they gone from the end of the world to a sweet old lady offering tea? She looked over at Jack and saw the same wonder and awe reflected on his face. They weren't alone. The world wasn't over. It wasn't done yet. They weren't done yet. There was hope, and people, and the cats that brought them all together. Enjoyed the story? Be sure to leave a review.